The third of the men we're commemorating today is Thomas Stallwood. Thomas was born in Kennington. He was the son of a carpenter, one of 6 children. He was baptised at St Mark's, Kennington. He grew up not to become a carpenter like his father, but it seems he probably went into the army. He's out of the country at the time of the Boer War, although we found no records of any military service. But when we next find him, he's at Banstead Asylum, one of the destinations for men who've just come out of the army and are looking for a job. And in 1906, he becomes an attendant, a male nurse at the asylum, probably living on site. It's a medical city. There's 2,500 patients being treated there, 200 staff living, all the single staff, the unmarried staff, they live on site, or the married staff have quarters provided for them just outside the asylum, or they find houses and homes in Banstead and Belmont to live in. He's probably living in an accommodation block there until the time of his marriage. He got married to a girl called Nellie, and they settled down at the bottom of Sutton in Beulah Road. And there they went on to have children, a family of their own. Now, unlike many of the asylum men, he didn't join up straight away when war broke out. He was a family man and he had responsibilities. He wasn't still in the reserves. The reservists at the asylum all went very quickly. The younger single men all volunteered very enthusiastically early on. It wasn't until later that he joined up. His next door neighbour, Albert Seal, his next door neighbour in Beulah Road, a man we commemorated as part of our World War I commemorations, who also worked at the asylum. He died in 1915 as a result of illness that he'd contracted in France. And he was buried at Sutton Cemetery. And it was only a week after his funeral, which we know Thomas and his wife attended, that Thomas joined the army, probably spurred on by the death of his friend. He too, like Alfred Reed, joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. And like him, we cannot know for certain what he was doing during the war. We know that he served on the home front until 1916. If he was a military veteran of the Boer War, he would have been extremely valuable in training new recruits. He also had years of experience as a male nurse and a medical orderly, effectively. And so he would have been able to pass those skills on to young recruits that were coming through. And he was perhaps doing that for a few months in 1915, before at some point from 1916 onwards going overseas. He didn't go to the Western Front. He went to Mesopotamia, another area that we haven't talked about at all. We landed in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in the early days of the war to secure the oil fields in the south of the country. There were several tribes in that area which were friendly to the British. The Ottoman Empire, who nominally controlled the area, didn't control it directly. They had proxies amongst the tribes that were there. So it was a patchwork of different alliances and control down there. So we went there as much to protect the oil as to kick a hornet's nest. We tried to stir up trouble against the Ottomans wherever we could. They were the weakest, really, of the Germans' allies. So we landed there. At the end of 1914, established a foothold. More and more reinforcements arrived, and we started to advance towards Baghdad in 1915. We were advancing up between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The two rivers really define the boundaries of the habitable zone in Iraq, or lower Mesopotamia, that area would be called in the times we're talking about. And so the transport infrastructure was absolutely appalling apart from the rivers. And so the men stuck to the rivers and they advanced up them in paddle steamers, or supplies were taken up by paddle steamers while the men marched up by the banks of the river. We didn't quite make it to Baghdad in that first go-round in 1915, and we suffered a serious setback at the village of the town of Kut al-Amara. It's a town that's nestled in a bend in the river. It's perfect for defence from the side that the Turkish were holding it, and we captured it and advanced further on, but were forced back into this town. Unfortunately, being perfect from the other side for defence, it was open really to the Turks when they came the other way, pushing us back into it. They surrounded the city, they besieged it for 3 months. We sent up a relief expedition, which was beaten back, and in early 1916 we had to surrender. Loss of something like the garrison of 15,000 men. It was hugely embarrassing. It was one of the worst defeats that we'd suffered in the war up until that point. Those prisoners did not have a happy time. They had to march through the desert for miles to Baghdad. They were extremely badly treated, and there was a very high rate of fatalities. It was, in effect, a death march into captivity. But reinforcements flooded in, and one of those reinforcements was probably Thomas Stallwood, sometime in September of 1916, when a group of 800 medical orderlies were landed at Basra. He was probably working in a base hospital there, rather than actually out in the field. And he would have worked in there dealing with all kinds of diseases, thousands of admissions for disease coming in every month, both from the locals that were in Basra and also the men of the expeditionary forces much further up the Tigris and the Euphrates. That campaign was coming to a successful conclusion when Thomas left Mesopotamia. He was sent to Salonika in Greece, very much like Mesopotamia in that they described it as a medical textbook come to life. You could find every kind of disease there. Malaria was the biggest killers, but dysentery, cholera, typhus, all sorts of horrible things. He probably worked in a base hospital in the port city of Thessaloniki, Salonika, for just 3 months, until that operation was again brought to a successful conclusion. It was the summer and the autumn of 1918. We were rolling back Germany's allies everywhere around the world, pretty much. But as that campaign came to the end, as the armistice was signed, he wasn't sent home to be with his family. He instead went to India, and he spent a year serving in India before he returned to his family. He returned home a changed man. The climate that he'd endured for the last 3 years was absolutely appalling. The chances are he spent at least one period in hospital with a serious illness of some kind, probably more than once as well. And he came home with a heart condition, cardiac failure. And he tried to resume his job at the asylum, which had been kept open for him, but after a few months, he had to resign on medical grounds. And not long afterwards, he died at home from an aortic embolism, aged 41. And he's buried in Sutton Cemetery, and we will be later laying a wreath on his grave. He left several children.